So I'm Dr. Solomon. I'm the Director of Undergraduate Research and Creative Activity. I've met some of you. I've only been here for 7 weeks, so I'm still new. They just took the wrapping off on me yesterday. And we're videoing these for folks who can't make the workshops, and I'm going to try to do that with these every month to put the video, and we're going to have it up on the interweb. I'm still working on that site, so make sure everybody knows it so that if you can't make a workshop because times never work out, we'll have them archived there so folks can see them. But I'm trying to schedule them on different days and different times every month so it moves around so we're not locked in the same thing. So the topic for this month's workshop is this question: what is research literacy? And you'll see where I'm going with this in a minute and where we're going to end up. This is a phrase which is now a big deal in higher ed. We all, for years, talked about information literacy. And everybody kind of knew what that was. It was how you gained and collected information. And it focused mostly around the library world, right? How do you use the library, how do you use the databases, etc. Then we got the development of this concept of research literacy, which is a little bit different. And so I'm going to talk about that a bit today. And then in the spring, probably in February, Professor Boykin in the library, sitting right here, and I are going to do a workshop together, and we're going to talk about what's different about information literacy and research literacy and where the two actually intersect. So what we're talking about are a variety of different things, right? Your ability to evaluate, to apply strategies. Yes, it uses Uncle Google and Aunt Yahoo to analyze questions and understand scholarly processes. All of those things kind of feed into what we're talking about when we talk about research literacy. Now, CNU, you may know, has what's called a quality enhancement plan. This is part of our accreditation process. We're required to submit a quality enhancement plan that explains some initiative that we're going to focus on for the next 5 years. The quality enhancement plan for the most recent accreditation at CNU was undergraduate research, particularly research literacy, which is why I got my job, because we're focusing on undergraduate research. And in the QEP, which is Quality Enhancement Plan, we define undergraduate research literacy in this way. It's a skill set that emerges as students learn to recognize, locate, evaluate, and synthesize information necessary to conduct a discipline-specific academic inquiry and produce work notable for its originality, rigor, and creativity. You can tell that probably 15 people worked on that definition, and it took them 3 months to sort of figure out exactly what they wanted to say, because you can tell that everyone kind of has their key word in there, right? If you're in the creative realm, if you're in the arts and humanities, well, it's got the creativity in there. If you're in the scientific world, it's got the rigor and the synthesis, right? So all those key catchphrases. But what the heck does that mean? Well, in the QEP, we outline 3 stages in this, and this is what I'm going to focus the workshop on today. Learning the research alphabet, learning research grammar, and then learning research synthesis. And along with having the video up on the interweb, I'm going to post the PowerPoints as well. So they'll be there for you. So research alphabet, research grammar, research synthesis. Let's talk about each one of those. So what does it mean to learn the research alphabet? It's teaching research skills to students and ultimately being able to translate that language between the university and real-world contexts. So think about it as the building blocks, right? I mean, most of us had, alphabet blocks when we were kids. And think about learning the alphabet stage as you just get the blocks and you kind of dump it out on the floor, right? You're not really sure how to arrange them in any way. You're learning the individual letters, right? And those of you who work with young kids know that that's how you start out with them, right? What is this letter? A. A is for whatever, right? This is the way we taught my daughter, who's 14 now. So what does that look like in this realm? Well, there's 3 sort of prongs to it. There's a descriptive element, an exploratory element, and an explanatory element. The descriptive element is the who, what, how, where, and when. The exploratory is a better understanding of the problem at hand, and then the explanatory actually explains the causes of the problem. So when you're learning the research alphabet, you're really in that descriptive phase. Okay, does that make sense? If you have a question or you want to say something, please don't hesitate. And the research alphabet, learning the research alphabet at CNU focuses on the library, right? I mean, that's really what we're talking about. When you're talking about the research process, learning the research alphabet means what are the things that are available over in the library? What are the databases that are applicable to your own field? What are the main reference books that you should be aware of? What are the main websites that you should be aware of? Is there somebody over in the library who's a particular specialist in your interest, and you should make sure you connect with them, right? A lot of larger research libraries, if you go into graduate school at R1 institutions, the big research libraries have subject librarians. So you will find the librarian who is the librarian for neuroscience and know that you can go to that person because they really are a specialist in that. And oftentimes those folks have a library degree and an advanced degree in the subject area. So the library is going to be important here. Obviously, learning how to use the library, and our librarians are terrific and are coming into some classes and doing trainings on this as part of our initiative with the QEP, and that's really important to learn how to do that. And a lot of people will say, well, you know, I know how to use all this. No big deal. You might know sort of how to click on things, but do you know how to use it then? So, you know, it's not just about, you know, finding the stuff up here and knowing that, well, the course reserves are there. And WorldCat Discovery, I don't know what that is, but who cares, right? Because I'm never going to use it. Wrong, right? If you've not used WorldCat Discovery, does people know what WorldCat is? What is it?
I don't know, like, the right definition.
That's okay.
I've used it when I'm, like, doing research.
Yeah.
I'll type in either, like, a book name or a keyword, and it'll show me the books that we have here at CNU.
Okay. So WorldCat is bigger than just the CNU catalog. So the CNU catalog shows you what we own here at CNU only. If you go to WorldCat, it's going to show you what everybody in the world has. So everything. So you can order things for interlibrary loan from there, because just because we don't have them doesn't mean that you can't get it. This obviously really important for research. Although there was an article actually that I read 2 days ago that said that Google Scholar is actually taking a big hit right now. And there's a little bit less reliability in doing a search in Google Scholar. Google's a tough one, right? I mean, it's a great tool, but the problem is that research shows that most people never go past the first screen of results. They never drill down. And for most searches, the first screen of results is almost always filled with paid things. They're things that have been sponsored and paid for, and that's why they're showing up in the search. You're all hearing about all the hubbub about the election, right? Paid ads in Google, Facebook, etc. So a big part of learning the research alphabet is the ability to evaluate sources. And we're talking not just about being able to evaluate sources on the web, but being able to evaluate journal articles, books, traditional sources, videos, everything. And so a colleague of mine in upstate New York, and Amy, I don't know if you're familiar with this, you've probably seen this somewhere, right? Developed this idea of TRAP. It's a way of evaluating sources. You look at the timeliness, the reliability, the authority, and the purpose. And that's the way you evaluate any given source. So if you're doing, again, research in neuroscience, I'm just picking that, right? And you've got a source. Well, you're going to look at the timeliness, right? What's the date of it, right? Was it published in 2016, or was it published in 1983, right? I don't know about you, but if I'm going for a neuroscience consult, I would hope my doctor's up on the most recent research, because anything that's going to be older than about 5 years probably in neuroscience is probably already out of date. So you want to check the timeliness. That does not mean that an older source might not be credible and applicable and usable for what you're doing, because it's going to be very discipline specific. So if you're in, for example, history or English, there are lots of things that were published in the 1950s that are still the most important things that have ever been published in their field. But with science, business, health science especially, more current is going to be better. Reliability. Who wrote it? Who's the author? What are their credentials? If there's no author listed, that should automatically be a red flag. Right? Authority. again, this is who are they? What are their credentials? Where are they from? Is it just, an independent researcher, which may be okay in some cases, or are they affiliated with a large research outfit, like a university or a foundation? But you also have to think there about purpose. What's their angle? So students often run into this when they're doing research in things that are controversial. The easiest one to pick is abortion, right? So you're researching abortion and you found this great information on the web that's really helpful for your argument. You have to pay attention. Who sponsored that information? Is it sponsored by Planned Parenthood? Is it sponsored by the pro-life movement? Because they're going to have their own particular bias and their angle on it. So really important. So track, timeliness, reliability, authority, purpose, really good way to do it. All right, so we got the alphabet, right? We're at that stage then where we've gone through enough, not just training, but we've done it, right? It's not enough with this stuff to go and sit and listen to the talk. You gotta go and walk the walk, if you will, right? The last workshop I gave, the analogy I was making to driver's ed, right? You sit in a classroom and you learn about how to drive a car. Are you gonna be ready to drive a car after the class is over? No, you gotta do it, right? You sit somewhere and somebody teaches you the mechanics on how to play golf. Does that mean you're going to have a good golf game from just that? No. Right? So you got to do it. So now we're talking about the research grammar. These are the foundations and specific disciplines that are related to research. It's putting together now the words and the sentences. So taking those blocks in the alphabet and arranging them so they start to make some kind of sense. But of course you can't do this until you've done the previous step, right? And again, think about little kids and reading, right? They're not going to be able to sit down and just start reading words on the page without having learned first the alphabet. The methods and methodology here are what's important. So it's becoming more familiar with tools and resources in your individual discipline. So what's your major?
Neuroscience.
Neuroscience also. God, we got all these neuroscientists. I feel so safe. What's your major?
Theater tech.
Oh, there we go. Okay. So theater tech. So, it's about becoming familiar with the tools and the resources in your individual discipline. They're going to be very different from the important tools and resources in your discipline. Right? Print and electronic sources. So knowing what are the good print spots to look for. What are the good, reliable journals? What are the good, reliable reference sources? Now, fewer and fewer of those are actually printed anymore. Most of them are electronic regardless. But you need to be aware of, where these things are coming from. Specialized lab equipment, right? Is there some piece of equipment that you are going to have to learn how to use before you can go to the next step? This is the grammar part. Sources of information. Where do you get your information from? I work in English and literature and religion and philosophy, the Middle Ages. That's most of my research has been in that area. And so students will come in when I've taught courses on St. Augustine. And I'll say, well, did you look in the Augustine Encyclopedia? And they're like, no, I had no idea that existed. Right? You need to know what those basic sources are. The discipline-specific databases. So if you're doing work in neuroscience, right, you're not just going to go to JSTOR, right? Because there are more specific databases dedicated to the field of neuroscience. And then also for some fields, knowing particular software, how to use it. So for example, that's a mass spec machine. How many people have worked with those before in the lab? Okay, what's your major?
Biology.
What's your major?
Biology.
Ah, see, there's a trend here, right? SPSS. How many people have worked with SPSS, the software? Do we have anybody here who's majoring in social sciences at all? That's why, right? Because SPSS mostly lives in social sciences, although now it's being used outside of that as a way to evaluate data. But this is a specific software program that you learn how to use. And people who are majoring in those specific areas learn how to use SPSS pretty early in their degree program. Because you're going to do any kind of advanced work, you got to know how to do that. The grammar again, right? Archival work, right? It might be going to a library or a museum and looking up, the history of some stage operation for a particular production of a play, right? How do you do that? How do you go to where do you find that stuff? right? Is it available online? Sometimes. A lot of times not. And, you know, focus groups. Right? So if you're in the business world or in social sciences, focus groups are huge. That's a big part of doing research. Right? With a PhD in English, I know nothing about focus groups, other than it has to go through a process of review and approval. So some examples. Right? So here's what research grammar looks like in arts and sciences. I had a student several years ago who was doing an exploration of the archetypes of Carl Jung, Jungian archetypes from the psychology world, in The Secret Garden. You know The Secret Garden? So what did she need to do before we went forward with this project? Well, she needed to get a familiarity with the Jungian archetypes. Well, how do we do that? Well, we did a reading of Jung's Archetypes in the Collective Unconscious, and she had to have an overview of the psychological readings of The Secret Garden. Without that stuff, anything that she did to try to explore the archetypes wasn't going to make any sense, because she didn't know about the archetypes and she didn't know what people had already done in this area. You know, there's nothing worse than hearing from a professor when you show up at the office and you're all excited. It's like, I found a new way to talk about this, and you tell them about it and they're like, that's not new, people have been doing that for 20 years. And they're like, oh, I had no idea, right? Because we never looked. So example. When I was in graduate school a million years ago, I was doing a big paper on Shakespeare. And it was a paper on Shakespeare and Copernican astronomy, because I work on really esoteric stuff. And I was arguing that Shakespeare was familiar with Copernican astronomy because you could see evidence of it in some of the plays. Okay? So I put together this wonderful argument. I went down to the Princeton Library, used things that they had in their archives to look at. And I built the base of my entire argument on a particular scholar's ideas. So in other words, when you're doing this kind of research, we're talking about, you know, basically erecting a building. Right? So what's your first layer? And if your first layer sucks, what's going to happen to the building? It's not going anywhere. So I built all of this on that first layer, because I found this guy who wrote a book in the 1920s who completely supported what I wanted to say. It's like, great, start building. Handed in the paper and got the draft back from my professor, and she said that basically this guy on whose shoulders I had built my entire paper was disproved in the 1930s as a kind of a quack. He was an independent scholar, and he just kind of made stuff up, and it was one of those oh crap moments, because now my whole building collapsed. And so I went into her and I was like, what am I going to do? You know, the whole thing just fell apart. And I've been working on it for 5 months. She's like, well, you know, see what you can salvage. So you take that piece out. His name was Leslie Hodson, by the way. I still remember to this day. And there was no Wikipedia at that time, so there was no way of checking who he was. There was no internet, because I'm that old. So there was no way of checking who he was. I just looked his name up in the card catalog. Library had his books. Great, must be good. All right. So took that out and tried to then rebuild what I had to make a better argument. It ended up being okay. It wasn't as strong as it was with his nutsy argument intact, but there you go. Research grammar in MBS, in behavioral sciences, in natural behavioral sciences. So if you're studying the craniofacial mutations in zebrafish, you need to have familiarity with the basic anatomy and physiology of the zebrafish. I would think, yes. Familiarity with basic lab procedures. You need to have competency, even maybe proficiency with phenotyping. Maybe people know what phenotyping is. Some of you people who are in biology are kind of nodding. Is that your biology too? And microscope skills. I mean, those are your basic things that you're going to need, right, before you can go forward and do anything. You don't have those things, you can't do the research. So let's say we got the grammar, right? We got that set now. We've learned how to do all that stuff. We're fairly competent in the procedural stuff. We know how to use the tools. Now comes the big part, the research synthesis. This is really what we're after. So we're applying the knowledge to independent efforts, such as independent research, internships, or service learning experiences. This is taking what you are discovering and doing something with it, synthesizing it. One of the big complaints about people in higher ed, in academia, in the scientific world, in the last 25 years has been, we're living in what stereotypically used to be called the ivory tower. We're all working on our stuff, and it's like we're in a little bubble, and we don't care about what's going on outside, right? How many of you have read Hamlet, Shakespeare's play, right? At the end of Shakespeare's play in Act 5, while they're all arguing inside the castle, Fortinbras' men are invading the country, and they have no idea. They're oblivious, right? And the argument is that we're like in the castle, we're not paying attention to anything. What's really important now is applying the research that we have, synthesizing that with what's going on in the world. How is this going to make a difference? How is it going to help? So if the research alphabet is a light bulb, the research grammar is learn how to turn it on. The synthesis is more about figuring out, how does that really work? And then the next step is doing something completely new with it. Right? So we go from something that's very basic to something that is completely new. So it's not just about getting to this point, you got to get here, but then it's once you're here, you come up with some completely new idea, some completely new way of doing things. The story that I love to tell about Dean Kamen, I told this in my talk at the beginning of the semester to the faculty. Dean Kamen is a guy who's got a think tank in New Hampshire. Long story, he developed a Segway, a thing that we were all supposed to be riding them around. I don't see anybody riding them around, it's at mall cops. And Kamen, at one point, was approached, he's developed all this medical equipment. He has lots of patents for medical equipment. He was approached at one point by an organization who said, we need a new kidney dialysis machine. The one we have is outdated, it's inefficient, doesn't work well, it's too big. We need something new. And so his think tank, his group worked on developing a new kidney dialysis machine. I think it took them 3 years. And in the process, they discovered a new and cheap way of purifying water that didn't require electricity. And so they were able to use that technology to send to third world countries where people are dying from drinking dirty water every day. And so here's the synthesis, the application. Yes, they needed the kidney dialysis machine, they got that. What else did he do? Well, they came up with a new way of purifying water. So we're talking about synthesis as putting together the pieces to see them in a new way. So it might not be the pieces are new. You know, let me go back to this again. A light bulb's a light bulb, right? But it's once you start taking it apart, it's like, well, what can we do here, right? And these two examples come from two scientific think tanks who are developing new light bulbs, new ways of doing this that are different, cheaper, more effective, don't have waste. And so, you know, they're coming up with just completely new ways. You know, some of it is kind of like, well, what if we put that in here? I remember seeing a story several years ago about a country in Africa, I forget which country it was, they had been given in the 1970s a tremendous number of vehicles so that they could get around in the countryside, the mountainside, right? And they were like, not Humvees, but Jeeps. And that was great. The problem was that over time they break down and they can't get the parts. So what they started to do was they started to look at ways of using things they already had for the parts that they needed and adapting things both ways. So there was another story that I'd seen about a tribe in South America, and they were trying to develop solar lighting for the tribe. Right? They needed solar energy because they don't have electricity out there. They were going to develop this way. They came up with this way of developing it, but again, no way of getting parts when things break down. So they designed it in such a way that it used parts from machinery that they had already that they weren't using. So there was all this outdated machinery sitting around, and they used the parts from that. Think about all the computers in the computer graveyards in the West, right? And because now we're walking around with, you know, this. I mean, you know, I don't know about you, my first computer cost me $2,600, you know, no Windows, no hard drive, you know, it had big floppy disk. That stuff is sitting someplace in a graveyard. Wouldn't it be great if we could take that stuff and use it somehow? The pieces that are in there. So it is putting the pieces together to see things in a new way. So it's really a sort of a stage process here, research literacy. Let me show you a better example. I really like this model, right, of moving from data to information to knowledge to wisdom. I think that's what we're doing in higher ed. That's what we're trying to do in classes. So being research literate, I would argue, is the ability to navigate that continuum. Right? You're starting off with data, so people will say, well, yeah, I know that. I know X, Y, or Z. You may know the information. Right? Data and information are pretty close together here. That's not knowledge. That's having a bunch of facts. Then you move to knowledge, it's that question, how? Right? You might know the who, what, when, and where, but then you say, well, how? And then the wisdom part is why. So I always like to say that, you know, my favorite students are perpetual 2-year-olds, because 2-year-olds are always saying, why? They always want to know why. Because they're looking for this. Right? And if we can do that, and it's a progression. It doesn't happen just like that. But you can get there, and you can get there fairly quickly. So I like this little drawing here, right, about knowledge, experience, and creativity. And this works really in the arts world, is a good application. Right? So knowledge is the bunch of dots. Experience is you can connect the dots. Creativity is, wow, look how I can connect the dots. So the one is, you know, is this doing a good job? Yeah. Is this doing a different kind of job? Yeah. It's not better, it's different. Right? So we might look at this and say, well, here's the knowledge. Here's what science might do with it. Here's what arts might do with it. It's a different approach to the research process. So some of you are familiar, if you've taken a psych class or an education class somewhere along the way, with this Bloom's taxonomy model, right? This goes back decades now, of the way that we learn and the structure of learning. That's okay and it's still usable. At CNU we've developed this idea of a research lens, right? So we talk about the 4 parts of being learning, exploring, navigating, and sharing. And it brings me back to this again, right? The learning is really these first 2 steps. Then the exploring and the navigating is up here. The sharing is all the way out here. So in other words, you're going to share what you now have developed as new wisdom, new knowledge. So it's no longer just that you're regurgitating the information that you're being told. That's important. It's an important step, isn't it? You have to do that in a 100 level class, right? In an intro class, you need to be given the information and you need to basically be able to give it back to show that, yeah, okay, I'm with you. Then you go to the 200 level class. Now it's a little bit different, right? It's no longer enough just to give back the information. Now you got to show that you can process it a little bit. And then when you get to the 300, 400 level classes, the really good students are able to take that stuff and do something new with it. So that the professor says, oh, I never thought about that before, right? Because you're showing us a new way of thinking about a problem. So the lens is our thing here. Next month I'm going to do 2 workshops at the beginning of December on our new travel fund. We've got a fund in the OURCA, which is the Office of Undergraduate Research and Creative Activity. My office is downstairs in 161, 3 floors down, or well, I guess 2 floors down. Right below us here, come by and see me. I'm happy to talk about research possibilities, things that you're already working on, things that you want to work on, conferences, publication, presentations, all that kind of thing. And to that end, we've got this travel fund that we're rolling out in the next couple of weeks. And at the beginning of December, I scheduled 2 different sessions on Tuesday and Thursday there to go through what it is, what's eligible, why you might apply, and how. So it's going to be an online process, and I'll have screenshots to show you what the online application looks like. So I brought with me a handout that I developed. Can't say I developed it because I stole most of it from Grinnell College, but I gave them credit. On some sample assignments that actually might enrich what we're calling research literacy. And I just want to run through some of these with you just to see if they sound familiar. Are you doing these kinds of things in classes? Would you like to if you're not? And maybe if you'd like to and you're not, you might suggest it to the prof. I know, amazing. So lots of ways to expand research literacy. Just let me run through some of these. So you can do an abstract or executive summary of a scholarly article. How many of you have done that somewhere along the line? Where you've taken a scholarly article and you've got to do an abstract or a summary, right? And you're asked to read that article, write an abstract or a summary, include the author's thesis, argument, evidence, conclusions. This is part of that evaluation, part of that trap thing. You can do the anatomy of a research paper. This one at first sounds nutty. You conduct the research, but you don't write the paper. You're like, well, why the hell would I want to do that? Well, where I was before, we had a second year English class that was just about research. And what you did was, you did the research paper in a class that you were taking, and you used that English class to write the paper, to learn how to do the research. So you might be taking, I don't know, cell bio, right? You got to write a research paper in cell bio. Well, this class would then walk you through how do you do the research? How do you put together a paper in biology? An annotated bib, I assume that we're familiar with this somewhere along the line. A biographical sketch is a good one, where you present a brief sketch of the author of a significant work. If I had done that about Leslie Hodson, I would realize that I shouldn't have gone down that road. A briefing paper, where you select a current problem and prepare a summary of the main issues involved and some solutions, including strengths and weaknesses, and you can argue for the solution that you think is the best. So think about the kinds of issues that we're running across at the moment in our culture, in our society. And I'm thinking about things like climate change, right? Race relations, I mean, all these kinds of things, healthcare, right? Where you look at, what's the problem, what are some of the solutions, which one might work best. You can do a campaign speech, where you take a position and write a campaign speech to persuade voters to support the position. You can compare reference sources. This is a really good one. It facilitates interdisciplinary understanding, where you take a specialized reference source, you take a topic in a specialized reference sources, you cover a number of academic perspectives. So the example there is looking at the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990, but you look at it as it's discussed in the fields of economics, education, history, law, sociology. They're all coming at it from a different angle. They all have different horses in the game. Contemporary conditions. You write a brief 2 to 3 page statement on a social or ethical or political condition that's contemporary to the major work or issue that's under study. So this works really well in theater and literature in particular, right? So let's say you're looking at The Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens, right? Well, what was the situation in Dickens' London regarding child labor and child labor laws? Contemporary reception looks at book reviews, right? How was the work, whatever it is, received at the time that it was written? So you want to go back, I'm working right now on a book-length study, it's a history of sin. And one of my arguments, we'll see if it works, is that you can use Darwin's evolutionary biology concept to apply to the way that sin has developed in the history in the West. So I've had to read a lot of Darwin. And part of that was going back and looking at how was The Origin of the Species actually reviewed when it was published. Did anybody care? Because again, I mentioned Copernicus before. When you go back to Copernicus, and Copernicus's work, we all know who Copernicus is, right? Copernicus' work was published in 1543. No one cared. No one read it. It didn't sell. It wasn't until Galileo came along and proved Copernicus's ideas were actually true that everybody took notice. So contemporary reception is an interesting one. The credibility of a course reading. Profs love this, right? So you're going to write an evaluative essay drawing on book reviews, biographical information, and discussion in your own analysis on the course reading. So you've assigned, the professor assigned some particular thing to be read, an article, a piece, an essay, and you're going to now look at it and say, is this credible? Is this something that we should be reading? And in particular, this works in a lot of fields. I was just, speaking of Darwin, listening to something the other day about Richard Dawkins' Selfish Gene. How many of you know that book? You know it? It's a really important work. It's a little dated now, and there's a discussion about, how applicable is that still? Cultural context. Right? So an example, students in international politics class research another country and then watch the political news through the eyes of someone in that country. So you can prepare diaries, letters, editorials, posters, speeches. You can be real creative, right? Use the New York Times, the Washington Post. Use the newspapers that are being published in that country and see how people are looking at it. Encyclopedia, Wikipedia articles. I'm always kind of wishy-washy on this, but you can write or update an encyclopedia article. You can select a stub, which is one of the placeholders for a topic in Wikipedia, and write an entry. Right? You know that Wikipedia has lots of things, they call them stubs. Right? So it's something for which there is no article yet, so they just put a kind of a placeholder in there. Well, you can write the article. Oftentimes I will have students in literature write an introduction to whatever text it is. So when I teach Milton's Paradise Lost, one of the assignments that students do is they have to write an introduction to each book of Paradise Lost. Pick a book and write an introduction. So again, that teaches them to deal with that kind of thing. Newspaper articles, letters to the editor are really good. Letters to the editor are a really good way of approaching things. Practical assignment. So an example, a course on animal behavior for biology and psych majors. Students were asked to design an experiment in the field of animal behavior and nutrition that proposed a research question so meaningful that a government agency or research institute might provide funding. They identified the appropriate funding agency, figured out the costs, submitted the proposal with the annotated bibliography, and then groups of students in the class acted as reviewers for the proposals. So it's almost like you're setting up your own little institute. Top 10 list. You develop a list of the most important, under-recognized, or overrated people, events, or creations in a particular field of study and justify your selections. In the literature world, I can think of lots, Dr. Paul. Yes?
Overrated?
Overrated, yeah. And it's one of the questions that interviewers love to ask authors. There's a column each week in the Sunday New York Times Book Review where they interview a writer, and one of the questions is often overrated or not, and they want to know, what do you think? Who's overrated? It's interesting what people come up with for answers. Understanding primary sources, comparing primary, secondary sources on the same topic. And then additional things are things like comparing print and web resources. I have had students do projects where they compare printed, annotated editions of the complete works of Shakespeare with an online site that has the complete works of Shakespeare. What's the benefit of one over the other? Creating a handbook or a research manual, following research trends, all sorts of things, writing field notes, and then, of course, lit reviews, which probably people are familiar with. So that's the kind of thing that we're looking at when we talk about research literacy. Do you see things on that list that you're doing in classes? Yes? Do you feel like it's advancing what we're talking about here? I mean, and sometimes, you're nodding, and everybody else is like, oh, I don't know. You might not realize it right away. It may take a little while. Oftentimes, it isn't until you're a senior that you kind of look back and you say, wow, that thing I did when I was a freshman was really helpful. At the time, it bored the hell out of me, and I didn't know why we were doing it. But now I see that was really helpful. Some of it is trusting yourself and trusting the educational process that we kind of know what we're doing, right? So we're not just having you do something in order to spin your wheels, that ultimately it fits into a bigger picture. You just not see it yet. Might be too far away from it to see it now. You might be too far away from it to see it even when you're a senior. I still have students who I hear from, and I'm sure Dr. Paul, you do too, who've long graduated and look back and say, gee, when we did that in that class, I didn't realize how important and significant that was until now. and I graduated 10 years ago, right? I have a statement in all my syllabi about deadlines. Had it in there for years. It says papers are due when they're due. If they're handed in late, they get a 1 grade deduction for each class they're late. If deadlines weren't important, it wouldn't begin with dead. I have students still contact me on Facebook who would become teachers years later who say they still remember that and they put it on their syllabi now. You know, so it's little things like that that may fit in later on. Questions, comments? So what year are you? What year are you?
Junior.
Junior.
Freshman.
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 Freshman. Oh.
Sophomore.
Sophomore.
Freshman. Senior.
Sophomore, good, okay. Never too early to get involved with research. So if you're a freshman, you know, you've been here as long as I have at this point. Actually, you've been here longer than I have because I came after classes started. You know, never too early to get involved with research. Come down and see me. Let's see what we can get you in with, right? And even if you're in something, a field that's really specialized, like neuroscience, and you're like, how am I going to do research in neuroscience? You'd be surprised how you might fit into a bigger puzzle. There's always a place for the different levels of ability in projects, regardless of the field, right? So you're in theater tech, you said, right? So I mean, you know, in theater tech, yes, there's important stuff that has to be done that you need to have some experience to be able to do. There's also stuff that has to be done that you don't need a lot of experience to do, right? I mean, you know, move that lamp, right? You know, and it's more than just the kind of gopher stuff. You're actually learning while you're doing that. And so that's really important. And as I mentioned earlier, you know, I'm gonna really stress and I'm gonna push you to do one thing. Let's see. I'm going to push you to ask why. To always be that 2-year-old. So if someone says something, say, well, why? Why is that? Right? And oftentimes they'll be able to tell you why. Sometimes they'll say, you know, I don't know. And I don't know about you, but that always kind of drove me nuts when I was younger. And so I would annoy the hell out of the librarians, because I was in the library all the time asking the weirdest damn questions. And this, like I say, is before Uncle Google came along. So, you know, you'd walk up to the reference librarian and ask, you know, I want to find out this. And like, I wouldn't even know where to start looking for that. And I know that half the time they must have looked at me and said, where the hell did he come up with that? Well, it came up somewhere, and I asked why, and the person said, I don't know. And I never took that as a sufficient response. I want to know why. Right? And you should want to know why about everything, really. That's what makes our existence, I think, doesn't it? That curiosity, that goal for learning new knowledge. So I thank you for your time. I know some of you have classes to go to. If you have questions or you want to talk to me, please come by. Send me an email note. Did I put my email up here? Look at that, I didn't, but I have cards now. My cards came yesterday. I know, it's so exciting. The first bunch came, but they had my email address wrong. I couldn't even use them when you were in the other day. So take a card if you'd like. Shoot me an email, and I'd be happy to sit down and talk with you about what you could do and what the possibilities are, either immediately or down the road. Let's plan for it, right? Especially if you are thinking of going on to grad school, or going into industry, or going into anything that's going to involve doing research. This is going to be really important on applications and on your resume. Employers want to see that you've done this. Graduate schools are going to require that you've done this. So thank you all. Thank you very much.